since many of the topics I deal with have to do with Norse mythology, the Viking Age, Iceland, or related to this, today I have for you a couple of comments on the life of our dear Snorri Sturluson, one of the most interesting characters in Icelandic history, and to my mind, one of the most interesting characters in medieval history. He is the first major writer of Old Icelandic prose, from whom we have a large body of extant writing. This is, if we accept that he did write what scholars nowadays think he wrote. There are many reasons to believe that he did. Yet again, we don't know for sure 100% because he did not leave any autographs on his works. People did not used to do that in the past. So we can just assume he did. His life, on the other hand, is pretty well documented. Interestingly, he was not a cleric, he was not a man of the church writing, but a layman. And he was also an aristocrat. And most of what he wrote was, in fact, on very secular topics. So the main sources we have for his life are the contemporary or the nearly contemporary Icelandic saga, the saga of the Icelanders, and the saga of King Håkon, King of Norway in the 12th century, both written by his nephew Sturla Þórðarson. And we also have some sagas related to the bishop Gudmund Arason. Okay, so what do we find out from these sources? Well, we find out that he was probably born in either 1178 or 1179. He was the son of a powerful chieftain by his name Hvams Sturla. To this name we link the age of the Sturlungs, which was not a very happy time for Iceland, because it is the very troublesome time with all this whole drive to acquiring more power and to getting rich, which eventually led to the collapse of the society as it was structured before the 1200s, leading to the loss of its independence to the favor of Norway. So this is not to say that before this drive to acquire power, Icelandic society was a democracy or a proto-democracy, as I often hear, but neither is it to say that it was a feudal system like in the rest of Europe. I'm going to make a separate video about how things worked from the time of the settlement until the age of the Sturlungs, but either way we had system of checks and balances between chieftains and farmers that managed to work pretty okay, also based on a lot of laws, legislation, and agreements between parts. Well, this was no longer the case in the age of the Sturlungs. Like I said before, this was the age of great conflicts between several Icelandic families trying to get as much dominance in the region as they could. Okay, so what happened to Snorri? Well, like in the case of many characters in Iceland at this time, he was sent to be fostered at a place called Oddi in southern Iceland. Fostering also meant getting an education, and it was a pretty common practice, and also a reason to gain prestige. As the foster family, you increased your social status. So he went to this place Oddi, and there he dwelled with another famous chieftain, Jon Loptsson. He was the grandson of another Icelandic historian, Samundur Frodi, so Samund the learned. To this historian, Many times the Poetic Edda was attributed. However, scholars have changed their minds regarding the authorship, and it is no longer known as the Edda of Semund, as was the case before. This young guy was a deacon. However, he was not that engaged in all this process of the extension of church power. And there was also the question of Odi being, some sort of school, some sort of clerical school, because in Europe, most of the education you would get from cathedrals and monasteries, so it was something in the vicinity of this. Did Snorri learn Latin? That's also a pertinent question to ask, because Latin was the lingua franca of Europe so many centuries. He might have, although there are no traces of him learning Latin in his prose. He does not use Latin. He only uses Latin for some concepts, but other than this, the theological ideas, for example, other than this, he does not. More important here is the fact that at Odi, he most certainly had access to a lot of material which has been lost, material in the vernacular language, such as the Eddic poems. The Eddic poems, which are preserved in another book, the Poetic Edda, this is considered to be our primary source for Norse mythology. Snorri, however, in his Prose Edda, approaches a lot of topics which are not approached in the Poetic Edda, so we came to the conclusion that he definitely had access to a lot of material that is no longer present, unfortunately. Not only material related to Norse mythology, but also definitely historical records about both Icelandic and Norwegian history. Okay. Well, if we imagine him, however, as this guy secluded in the chamber all day long, thinking of what his ancestors believed in, and wondering about Thor's adventures and so on, we are mistaken, because he was not as dreamy as we might think, because he wrote all these things about religion, mythology, stories, and so on. He was pretty down to earth, and like his contemporary chieftains, he also desired power, and he was very keen on getting it, which is why in these sources that we have on his life, he does not lend us the impression that he was a very likable, pleasant character. He was also embroiled in this conflict, although he was a man of great learning. That's beyond any doubt. So what did he do? Well, to gain more power. Well, at the age of just 20, he married Herdis. She was the daughter of a wealthy chieftain in Borg. Borg is the place connected to the famous poet Egil Skallagrimsson. And by the way, Snorri is also suspected of having written this saga, although it is not certain. So he went to live here in Borg, and he acquired by either inheritance or buying, or just by intimidating other people, a lot of chieftaincies, the so-called Gothord, or at least had a share in them, in this region of the Borg fjords. And after a couple of years, he moved to Reykholt, and there he gained possession of a couple of churches. And interestingly, from this time, we have a list of some gifts for this church in the Reykholt chieftaincy, and we might also have his autograph. There is a short entry there that might look like his autograph. So in short, he became a very rich and powerful man. What he did is, of course, another sign of what was happening, the deep changes that were happening in Iceland in the 13th century, which was basically a very small number of powerful families acquiring everything for themselves, and this individualistic approach of society was gaining ground. And this was, of course, to the advantage of Norway, who wanted to have a say in this whole story. Snorri also had some disputes with some merchants afterwards, sometimes legal ones, also on the verge of war on a couple of occasions. And he was also a law speaker in the General Assembly, the so-called Althing. Interestingly, this is a thing I find very cool. Everyone had a booth, at the General Assembly, and Snorri gave the name Valhall, so Valhalla, to his booth. Okay, and from this time, we're talking about, let's say, 15, he started to work on his poetry. So he sent a poem, for example, to Jarl Håkon in Norway. He also composed about the Jarl's wife, and unfortunately these poems are lost. He also composed some poems about Earl Skuli Borðarsson, probably during his first visit in Norway, which happened about 1218, 1220. There are a couple of lines of a refrain which actually survive. And we also have some lines surviving about Bishop Guðmundur. Well, when he was in Norway, Snorri became known to the young king Håkon, and he received some titles, some honorary titles. For example, he was the cupbearer. Yeah, so this was an ordinary title, being the Skutilsvein of the king. That meant that the king started trusting him, and he also gained the title of Lender, mother. This meant that he was a landed man, so a man of a greater social position. This, however, did not come without any price whatsoever. No, he had the task to make Iceland subject to the King of Norway, or at least contribute in doing so. Well, it is to say here that he was on better terms with Jarl Skuli than he was with his son-in-law, so with King Håkon, and he did manage at some point to convince Jarl Skuli to drop this project of invading Iceland. For this, he stayed with him. To enforce this, he stayed with him for 2 winters. Well, upon returning, he was not really welcome by the other chieftains of Iceland, because he wanted to sell Iceland to Norway, or at least that was the perception at the time. But that actually was not really that long lasting, because he did nothing whatsoever to fulfill his promise to King Håkon and Earl Skuli. He entered some other partnerships in the meantime, with Hallveig, for example, considered to be the richest woman in Iceland at the time, and now Snorri also became the richest and most powerful man. He also had a second presidency of the Althing, which lasted until the second visit to Norway, which was in 1237, something like that. In the meantime, he was involved in a lot of violent disputes with other Icelandic chieftains, including his brother and his nephew Sturla. So that was not very fortunate, not even in terms of maintaining family harmony. So on his second visit to Norway, he tried to have even less to do with King Haakon. He spent a lot of time with Earl Skulli in Trondheim, and afterwards he returned to Iceland in 1239, although the king banned him from doing so. Okay. In the meantime, Skulli was hoping to become himself king of Norway, so he rebelled against the king, but he was killed. In the meantime, in Iceland, another important chieftain called Gizur was becoming dominant, and he also gained the favor of King Haakon. And due to this new alliance, friendship, he received a commission from the king to force Snorri to return to Norway or else kill him. The grounds for this was that he had become a traitor to the king because he did not fulfill that promise to try to enforce that idea in Iceland that it would be better off under the dominance of Norway. So poor Snorri ends up killed. He takes refuge in his cellar. This happens in 1241, and Gizur's men find him there and kill him. Was he a hero? Was he a traitor? Well, that, taking into account what was happening in the age at that point, perhaps neither of them. He just acted in such a way which he considered most practical for him. He wanted to preserve his power, that's for certain, but he also entertained this this thought that was common for many Icelanders of not falling into the sphere of influence of another power. So although he displayed this this closeness to the Norwegians, on the other hand, he apparently did not wish to submit to them wholly. Okay, so regarding his work now, well, we have first of all the Snorri Edda, so the Prose Edda, or the Younger Edda. This is an account of mythological happenings. In his own concept, he tries to make out of this a very coherent and organized story, and Norse mythology was far from being that. It is to be mentioned here that this is a secondary source for Norse mythology that we have, but without this, it would be much worse. There would be many things we would not understand, or at least attempt to understand. So we need to give him credit for that, for writing these stories. However, it is also worth mentioning that in terms of how he presents this information about Norse mythology, it is clear that he remains fully Christian, so he does not have any intentions of drawing a polemic between these two mythologies of religion. He is very interested in just presenting the stories in such a way that future poets understand the use of metaphors, the so-called kenningar, the complex metaphors in skaldic poetry, which were many times based on some mythological reference. So it was his ideal, to inspire young poets to write as the ancestors did. That's why he actually groups this work, the Snorri Edda, into several parts. So it begins with Gylfaginning, which is a story, an account about the beginning and the end of the world, an account about different attributes the gods had, or different interesting stories they were engaged in. Then he has the Skålskaparmál, which is an analysis of poetic language, and where he draws on examples from a lot of earlier poets, over 70 poets. So it is an extension of the narrative he starts in Gylfaginning. And then we also have the Hotatal, which is providing patterns of nearly 100 verse forms and meters, remarkable for its technical complexity, and also kind of hard to understand. Other than this, he has the Olaf Saga Helga. This is his separate saga on the life of the King Olaf turned into a saint. It's quite a realistic depiction, actually, and he doesn't really draw that much on miracles. He rather has a rationalistic explanation for them. This saga is then integrated into the Heimskringla. This is the history of the kings of Norway, and it begins with the Ynglings, the legendary kings, the legendary Swedish kings, descending from the gods themselves, and then he writes this history until 1177. The earliest attribution of the work to Snorri dates back to the 17th century. It is now widely accepted, but like I said before, we cannot be certain. However, interesting related to this aspect is the fact that his political views on the relationship between Norway and Iceland don't always come out very clearly. He did not have anything particular against kingship. There are a couple of Norwegian kings that he admired, and he also enjoyed being a poet and a courtier with these kings. But on the other hand, he does have some references to the fact that Iceland should stay independent. In the speech of Einar, for example, we have this idea that he was becoming more aware of the fact that Iceland was getting more and more dominated by Norway, and it was in danger. What else would be to say? Regarding the mythological part, we can also use the Ynglinga saga, which is the first saga of the of this collection of sagas, the Heimskringla, the disc of the world. However, we must proceed with caution whenever we use these sources as material for much older times, because he's not being really consistent either. So if we read the Ynglinga saga and the Snorri Edda, for example, in the Ynglinga saga, he dwells on this idea of turning gods into people. So this idea of euhemerizing the gods, a concept which he then abandons almost abandoned in the Snorri Edda. We have, for example, in the Ynglinga saga, a reference to the war between the two families of gods. This is not a part of the Poetic Edda. Also, he rather tries to explain poetry and not content, which is why we have these very different types of information, pieces of information in both sources. Well, regarding the other sagas, the more historical sagas in the Heimskringla, Snorri's reputation as a historian is also suggested by sources such as the Orknøya saga, and in the Icelandic saga, Snorri's nephew said that he spent a lot of time having Snorri's histories copied. So he was probably referring to this work, to the Heimskringla. So yeah, most probably those people writing in the 17th century about this will write in citing him as an author. The sources that he uses for his great work, the history of the kings of Norway, were most definitely very varied, ranging from genealogies and the so-called Årtala to works by another prominent historian by the name of Ari. He probably also used some later compilations also in Latin and so on. But either way, so he seems to be very interested in bringing to life this ancient history of Iceland and linking it to the ancient history of Scandinavia, or the early medieval history of Scandinavia, Norway, respectively, in order to link the present to the past, and also we should appreciate him for that, because after this great work, the Heimskringla, the great historical writing ceases. So maybe there was this sense among other historical enthusiasts that his work could not be improved, could not be bettered. There was no better than what Snorri did for the history of his people. Okay. Yeah, so I think this was it. Half an hour, I think it's enough. A small, brief picture of who Snorri was, and an occasion to reflect on his work and on his importance. Of course, there was much more to say about this, but let's credit him with at least these two vital works, which, besides their literary value, also have a historical value, if not for what he is writing about, at least for the way Icelanders in the 13th century were perceiving and interpreting their own past. If you haven't read the Snorri Edda so far, I recommend you the edition translated by Anthony Fawkes from the Everyman Publishing House. It's a very good translation, and there you will find a lot of interesting stories about Norse mythology, and a lot of poetical language explained. So it's really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for watching. Follow me for more videos on similar topics. Like and subscribe and help my channel grow. Having said that, I wish you a beautiful day and see you soon.